1897, Kentucky, in the remote, fog-choked town of Ash Hollow. Tragedy struck under circumstances so inexplicable whispers of the events have lingered for over a century. One night, a series of fires erupted within the local orphanage, consuming its wooden halls and leaving the charred bodies of children as grim reminders of a horror no one could fully explain. The townsfolk spoke of things that defied reason, shadows that darted through corridors with no discernible source, voices whispering in languages no one recognized, and eyes faintly glowing peering from the smoke, vanishing the instant they were confronted. Some believed the children themselves were touched by force beyond human comprehension. Others argued that the fires revealed the sins of the town, manifesting in a macabre display that blurred the line between innocence and evil. The Ash Hollow orphanage was meant to be a sanctuary, yet its walls seemed to echo with dread. Local records speak of a strict, almost obsessive caretaker, Reverend Malachi Thornton, whose sermons and writings hinted at purification and hidden rituals. Scholars have debated whether Thornton's intentions were protective, delusional, or malevolent, but the flames offer no answers, only questions. Historical documents confirm the existence of these fires and the deaths of several children. Yet eyewitness accounts layer a murkier, more unsettling narrative atop the cold facts. People recall the smell of smoke mixing with something sweeter, almost unnatural. The sight of shadows that moved independently. The sensation of being watched, even when no one was near. In Ash Hollow, reality and myth entwined. Was this the work of human hands, born of neglect or cruelty? Or did some darker force find its way into the orphanage, feeding on fear and shaping tragedy? Psychology and folklore collide in this story. Some experts argue that trauma and fear can create hallucinatory phenomena, while others insist that superstition and rumor amplified genuine horrors. The boundaries between fact and fiction, sanity and madness, morality and malevolence, blur with every whispered retelling. As this story unfolds, viewers are drawn into a world where innocence and evil coexist uneasily, where children's laughter may hide cries of terror, and where the past refuses to release its grip on the present. Every shadowed hallway, every charred beam, every record of Thornton's words becomes a question rather than an answer. Was this tragedy a chain of accidents, deliberate cruelty, or an encounter with something incomprehensible? Perhaps the flames consumed not only the orphanage, but also the truth itself. As we begin this journey into Ash Hollow, prepare to confront a tale where certainty evaporates in smoke, and every answer breeds deeper questions out in the heart of Kentucky's rolling hills. Hidden away from the commerce and bustle of nearby towns, stood a building meant to be a beacon of hope. It was small at first, just a single brick structure with tall windows and a modest wooden steeple that rose above its roofline. The townsfolk of Ash Hollow called it an orphanage, though to the children who were placed within its walls, it was something far more complicated, both a sanctuary and a prison. The man behind it all was Reverend Malachi Thornton. His name was spoken with reverence in Sunday services and with suspicion in quiet taverns. Born to a family of coal miners in eastern Kentucky, Thornton's early years were marked by loss. His mother perished when he was 6. His father, consumed by alcohol and despair, died only a few years later. Raised briefly by relatives, Thornton eventually entered the ministry, gaining a reputation as a fiery preacher who spoke of sin, salvation, and purification with unusual intensity. Thornton's sermons, recorded in fragments by parishioners, frequently returned to the imagery of fire, not merely as a biblical punishment, but as a force of cleansing. He preached that fire stripped away corruption, that flame revealed truth. Some claimed he was a man inspired, a shepherd leading the wayward to redemption. Others whispered that his fascination with fire bordered on obsession, that it was less metaphorical than it appeared, more dangerous than the congregation realized. When he announced the establishment of Ash Hollow Orphanage in 1883, many welcomed the idea. Kentucky's rural counties were scattered with children left homeless by disease, mining accidents, and poverty. The orphanage promised shelter, education, and spiritual guidance. Land was donated, funds were raised, and the town's carpenters built the structure under Thornton's supervision. At first glance, the orphanage seemed like an institution of mercy. Its rooms were plain but orderly. The children were clothed, fed, and schooled in the scriptures. They tended small gardens in the back, their laughter occasionally drifting through the hollow. Thornton was known to lead morning prayers, his voice deep and commanding, filling the narrow halls with psalms. Town records show donations of flour, clothing, and coal arriving regularly. And yet, from the very beginning, there were cracks in the picture of piety. Survivors would later describe the strictness of Thornton's rules: silence after sundown, mandatory attendance at sermons that stretched long into the night, punishments for even the smallest infractions. Abracandish might mean kneeling for hours on cold stone floors. Whispered questions during prayer could result in a lashing from a switch cut fresh from the orchard. What unsettled the children most were Thornton's private rituals. Several orphans recalled the Reverend's habit of lighting candles in the dormitories and murmuring over them in tones no one could quite understand. He would sometimes hold a candle near a child's face, staring intently into their eyes as though searching for something hidden within. On cold nights, he gathered them around the furnace, forcing them to sit silently as he spoke of sins being burned away, of unclean spirits driven into the smoke. Local townsfolk began to gossip. Some said they saw strange flickers of light in the windows long after midnight. Others swore they heard chanting carried on the wind, rhythmic and low, unlike any hymn known in the churches of Kentucky. Rumors spread that Thornton was less a protector of children and more a captor, molding them through fear and fire. But there are other accounts too conflicting, complicating. Some former residents insisted Thornton was stern but fair, that his discipline kept them from starvation or the dangers of the streets. A few claimed they owed their survival to his care, that he offered them a home when no one else would. Historians point out that records of orphans finding apprenticeships and even attending school in Lexington exist, evidence that the orphanage fulfilled its stated purpose in at least some cases. It is this tension between benevolence and cruelty, sanctuary and prison, that forms the heart of Ash Hollow's mystery. Was Thornton a zealot driven by unshakable faith, or a broken man whose obsession with fire turned children into subjects of his experiments in purification? Psychologists who later studied the case have suggested that Thornton's fixation on fire might stem from childhood trauma. Coal mining accidents were common in Kentucky, and entire families were lost in explosions underground. To a boy who grew up amidst the smell of soot and the roar of collapsing tunnels, fire was both destroyer and purifier. Others argue that Thornton suffered from religious mania, a condition where a scripture becomes twisted through the lens of mental instability. In his mind, children may have represented the souls of a nation innocent, yet in need of cleansing from inherited sin. Folklore from the region adds another dimension. In Appalachian tales, fire often symbolizes not only destruction, but also revelation. There are stories of witch fires that exposed hidden wrongs, of purifying flames that revealed truth. Thornton, immersed in this culture, may have believed was enacting a sacred duty. The orphans themselves lived in this contradiction. They played in the fields, learned their letters by candlelight, and recited verses from memory. Yet many also described a constant sense of dread. One boy latericaled, "It felt like the walls watched us." The air was heavy like smoke, even when no fire burned. Anatha remembered Thornton's sermons about the flames of God's justice, sermons that left the children trembling in their bunks. Town records note that inspections were rare. The orphanage lay several miles from the nearest courthouse, and oversight was minimal. Thornton's reputation as a man of God shielded him from scrutiny. Complaints from the children were dismissed as exaggerations, the fantasies of troubled minds. Still, A few incidents pierced the town's complacency. In 1887, a visitor reported seeing children scrubbing the floors with raw, reddened hands while Thornton stood nearby with a lit lantern, warning them not to leave a single stain. In 1891, a traveling priest wrote of hearing strange cries from building at night, though he could not determine if they were prayers or something more sinister. By the mid-1890s, the orphanage was both respected and feared. Families continued to send their children there, often with gratitude, yet stories circulated of the Reverend's harsh methods. Some said he believed certain children were born tainted, marked by sins of their parents, and that they required harsher discipline. A chilling rumor claimed that he once locked a boy in a coal cellar for 3 days, emerging only to press a candle into the child's hand, forcing him to carry the light until his soul was clean. Psychologically, the children existed in a state of duality, safe from starvation, but subject to rituals that blurred the line between care and cruelty. Their innocence was preserved in moments of play and laughter, yet overshadowed by the looming figure of Thornton and his obsession with the flames. As the years passed, the building itself seemed to take on a character. Survivors spoke of creaking floors that groaned at night, of drafts that felt like whispers along the hallways. The smell of smoke lingered even when the hearths were cold. To the children, the orphanage was alive, its very walls infused with Thornton's sermons and the residue of fear. And yet, despite all of this, the orphanage endured. Donations continued, new children arrived, and the Reverend maintained his role as guardian and shepherd. Outwardly, the institution thrived. But beneath the surface, tension simmered between faith and fanaticism, care and cruelty, truth and rumor. It is in this simmering atmosphere that the first sparks of tragedy would eventually ignite. But before the flames consumed the orphanage, before the town of Ash Hollow was forever marked by fire and loss, the seeds of destruction were already sown in the contradictions of its founder, and the shadowed halls where children prayed, feared, and waited. The winter of 1894 was one of the coldest Ash Hollow had ever known. The river froze solid, snow piled against the edges of barns and houses, and the townsfolk prayed each morning for coal enough to last another day. The orphanage, perched at the edge of the hollow, stood like a lonely sentinel against the pale sky, its windows darkened, its chimney scouring smoke that barely cut the freezing air. Inside, the children huddled beneath threadbare blankets, their breaths visible in the lamplight, their stomachs rumbling more often than they were filled. It was on one such night, January 12, that the silence of winter broke in screams. 3 children, all under the age of 10, had been placed in the nursery room, a small chamber at the northern end of the building. At midnight, townsfolk recalled seeing a faint orange flicker dancing in the orphanage windows. At first it seemed harmless, perhaps a lantern left burning. But moments later, the glow intensified, erupting into a blaze so fierce it illuminated the frozen fields like dawn breaking at midnight. Witnesses spoke of shadows darting behind the windows, of silhouettes writhing as if trapped by invisible hands. Some swore they heard not just screams, but whispers, strange, rhythmic, and chillingly calm amidst the chaos. The fire consumed the nursery before help could arrive. When the townsfolk finally managed to force the doors open, all that remained were charred beams, collapsing walls, and the lifeless bodies of 3 children. The official reports, penned by the county fire inspector, described a rapid combustion of bedding and wooden furnishings, possibly triggered by unattended candles. Thornton, the Reverend and caretaker, insisted that a child must have knocked over a lantern while rising in the night. But these explanations did little to quiet the whispers spreading through Ash Hollow. Medical records, preserved in fade ink, tell another part of the story. The children bore not only burns, but peculiar markings on their skin, swirls and blisters that did not resemble the ordinary patterns of flame. One physician described them as spiral-shaped, almost elaborate. as though branded rather than burned. This note, later dismissed as hysteria, became the kernel of dark rumors that the fire was not an accident, but a ritual. Survivors among the orphans later spoke of strange events in the days leading to the fire. One girl remembered waking to the smell of smoke long before any flames were visible. Another claimed she saw Reverend Thornton walking the corridors at night with a candle, murmuring in words she did not recognize. And one boy, trembling in his testimony years later, swore that he saw eyes in the smoke, glowing faintly as though alive, watching from the nursery's corner until the fire erupted. The townspeople, faced with tragedy, did what the mans often do when reason fails: they built stories. Some believed the orphanage was cursed, its foundation laid up in land tainted by older, darker rituals. Others insisted the children themselves were marked by evil, carrying the sins off their parents into the home. Still others blamed Thornton directly, arguing that his obsession with fire had finally crossed the line into cruelty. But a smaller number, those most deeply unsettled, spoke in hushed tones of something beyond human intention. They recalled the unearthly glow, brighter than any ordinary blaze, and the screams that seemed to rise and fall in unison, like a chorus. They wondered if the fire had been summoned, not sparked. Psychologists who later examined the case argued that trauma and suggestion played a role. In times of disaster, the mind seeks patterns, they explained. A child's cry can sound like a whisper. Shadows can move of their own accord when smoke bends the light. Perhaps the survivors, overwhelmed by fear, invented details their minds could not otherwise process. But these explanations failed to erase the unease. Rationality may account for hallucination, but it cannot silence the raw emotion of memory. Reverend Thornton himself became a figure of suspicion. His insistence that the fire was an accident, his swift burial of the children, and his refusal to allow townsfolk to linger near the charred nursery only deepened the mystery. In his sermons that followed, he spoke of souls tested by flame and innocence revealed through suffering. These words, delivered to a grieving town, struck many as cruelly detached, even triumphant. Was he mourning or proclaiming a victory only he understood? Yet not all agreed on his guilt. Some pointed out that he had risked his own life dragging children from the burning hallways, his hands blistered, his robes singed. A few survivors remembered his voice shouting for order amidst the panic. These details complicated the story, casting Thornton as both savior and suspect, protector and predator. The tragedy divided Ash Hollow. Neighbors debated in taverns, churches, and markets. Was the fire a simple accident, the tragic outcome of a poorly tended lantern? Or was it the first revelation of a darkness festering within the orphanage walls? The more people spoke, the more the story changed. Over time, the fire ceased to be a single event and became instead a canvas onto which every fear, suspicion, and superstition was painted. Folklore began to grow. Some said the 3 children did not die at all, but were claimed by the fire as an offering. Others believed their spirits remained in the building, their voices sometimes heard in the wind, rattling through broken beams. A century later, visitors to the ruins still report the faint sound of children crying, mixed with the hiss of phantom flames. But perhaps the most haunting detail lies in the contrast between fact and myth. The fire inspector's report lists a clear cause: an overturned lamp. The medical examiner's notes describe burns consistent with exposure to flame. These are theckled facts, preserved in ink. And yet, standing against them are the testimonies of ordinary people who swore they saw something unnatural. Which carries more weight, the official record or the human memory? Which is more trustworthy, paper or witness, science or fear? As weeks passed, Ash Hollow attempted to move on. The orphanage was repaired, the nursery rebuilt, and the remaining children continued their lives under Thornton's care. But something had shifted. A scar had been carved into the town's memory, one that no reconstruction could erase. Parents who once considered the orphanage a blessing now wondered if it was a curse. Children whispered at night, fearful not only of fire but of the shadows it cast. Thornton's sermons grew stranger, his language more apocalyptic, as though the fire had confirmed his theology rather than shaken it. The tragedy was never fully explained. To this day, historians and believers debate, were those first flames the product of negligence, ritual, or something that defies classification? If it was mere accident, why did the details inspire so much terror? If it was deliberate, what kind of mind would sacrifice children to the fire? And if it was neither, if it was something older, darker, unbound by reason, then what truly burned in Ash Hollow that night? The fire took 3 lives, but it left behind far more than ashes. It birthed a legend, one that blurred the line between human evil and supernatural dread. In that bitter winter, the people of Ash Hollow found themselves staring into the flames, searching for truth and finding only more questions. And so the stage was set. The town had seen the first sparks of tragedy, and in those sparks lay the beginnings of an even greater conflagration, one that would pit science against superstition, faith against reason, and leave generations haunted by smoke that refuses to clear. The ashes of the first fire still clung to the beams of Ash Hollow Orphanage when the town demanded answers. 3 children dead, a building scarred, and whispers spreading faster than any flame. Such tragedy required explanation. Yet the question of how and why quickly fractured into 2 opposing paths, one paved with the tools of science, the other with the shadows of superstition. The county fire inspector arrived first, his boots crunching through the brittle snow, his notebook already open before he crossed the threshold. His report, written in neat script, catalogued the scene with clinical detente. He noted the warped bed frames, the position of charred timbers, the angle of collapse. To him, the answer was straightforward. The fire originated in the northern nursery, he wrote, likely due to an overturned lamp or an unattended candle. The rapid spread was aided by dry bedding and wooden furnishings. Structural weakness as contra to the intensity of the blaze. The words offered comfort to those who sought reason, but to many in Ash Hollow they rang hollow. Doctors followed, summoned to examine the remains. Their findings were equally pragmatic. The children had suffered smoke inhalation before burns consumed their bodies. Their lungs, blackened by soot, revelateth came not in fire but in suffocation. One physician noted peculiar spiral burns upon their skin, describing them as aberrant blistering patterns, yet his colleagues dismissed the observation, attributing the shapes to folds in fabric and to vain exposure to heat. Science, once more, leaned toward accident. But the people of Ash Hollow were not convinced. They gathered in taverns and churches, whispering of curses, of sins inherited by the children, of demons drawn to Thehalao like moths to flame. Superstition thrives where grief and fear intertwine, and grief in Ash Hollow was thick as the smoke that had choked its children. For every voice that urged caution, another demanded recognition of forces unseen. The clergy stood divided. Reverend Thornton, his eyes lit with a zeal that unsettled even his allies, preached of purification. "The flames test us," he declared from his pulpit. "The innocent are not lost but refined. Their souls cleansed be the holy fire." His words, meant perhaps to console, instead ignited suspicion. If the deaths were purification, who had demanded the sacrifice? God or Thornton himself? Other ministers urged restraint. Pastor Samuel Coleridge of Vennyboring Parish argued that fire was no more than nature's cruelty when mishandled by men. "We must not look for devils in every shadow," he warned. But his voice was drowned beneath the fervor of both believers and skeptics alike. Letters from townsfolk reveal the tension vividly. One blacksmith wrote, "If it were an accident, why do I hear children in my dreams, their voices calling from the smoke?" A schoolteacher penned, "There are things in that house which science cannot measure." The Reverend walks as though the fire was not tragedy, but fulfillment. Each account straddleth, line between rational doubt and supernatural conviction. Meanwhile, journals belonging to Thornton himself hint at an obsession few dared to confront. Preserved in fragments, his entries spoke of purification through suffering and the cleansing of inherited sin. He wrote of fire as a tool, a sacred instrument, more powerful than sermon or scripture. The flame reveals, he scribbled in one passage, and in revelation there is truth. The innocent are not destroyed but remade. Whether these were the reflections of a grieving caretaker seeking meaning or the ramblings of a man teetering in fanaticism remains debated to this day. Psychologists who later studied the case saw the conflict of science and superstition as inevitable. Tragedy, they argued, often forces communities to seek meaning where none exists. To accept random misfortune is unbearable. To believe in purpose, even a dark one, offers twisted comfort. Thus, science provided explanations of negligence and error, while superstition offered stories of sin and sacrifice. Each path soothed different fears, one the fear of chaos, the other the fear of moral corruption. But the unease in Ash Hollow was not so easily tamed. Superstition carried a power science could not match. Children whispered that the orphanage was haunted. Farmers refused to walk past it after dusk, claiming to see smoke rising where no chimney burned. Mothers crossed themselves when Thornton passed in the street. The line between fact and folklore blurred with each retelling, until even those who sought truth could no longer separate memory from myth. Yet the scientific investigation did not end. Weeks after the fire, inspectors returned with chemical tests. They scraped residue from the beams, examined ashes under crude microscopes, and measured the airflow of the building. Their findings, while methodical, raised new questions. Traces of faxolent were noted, though dismissed as remnants of lamp oil. Structural flaws were documented, yet none explained the speed with which the nursery ignited. Some whispered the report had been softened to spare the orphanage from condemnation, others that Thornton himself had pressured officials to avoid scandal. At the same time, folklore grew more elaborate. Tales spread of a pact made by Thornton with forces unholy, trading children's lives for divine favor. Others claimed the land itself was cursed, steeped in blood long before the orphanage rose. Still others insisted the children were not victims, but vessels, their bodies consumed so their souls might serve some eternal fire. These stories, though wildly varied, shared a common theme, the belief that the blaze was no accident. Moral philosophers later seized upon Ash Hollow as a case study in human understanding of evil. Was evil innate, they asked, or circumstantial? If Thornton truly believed in purification, was he wicked or merely deluded? Could superstition itself, unchecked, become a form of cruelty equal to negligence? For every answer proposed, another question emerged, deepening the mystery rather than resolving it. The tension between science and superstition left the town suspended, torn between two worlds. On one side stood doctors with their stethoscopes, inspectors with their reports, rationalists with their insistence on accident. On the other stood grieving parents, trembling survivors, and a reverend whose sermons hinted at truths too dark to dismiss. Neither side triumphed, for neither could silence the other. And it is in this tension that unease thrives. A letter written by a surviving nurse captures it best. I hear the doctors speak of negligence, yet I saw the fire leap as if alive. I hear the reverend speak of cleansing, yet I see no innocence in suffering. I do not know what truth remains, only that both sides blind themselves to what they fear most. The debate prepared the way for the most compelling evidence of all, the testimonies of those who lived through the fire. For science could measure ashes and superstition could weave tales, but the words of children who breathed the smoke carried a weight neither could easily dismiss. And as the town turned to listen, the chasm between fact and faith grew wider still. The orphanage did not simply burn. It ignited a struggle over meaning itself. And in that struggle, Ash Hollow revealed more than the cause of a fire. It revealed elements of certainty, the fragility of belief, and the human need to find truth even when truth refuses to be found. The fires left behind more than ashes. They left voices broken, trembling, insistent voices that would echo for decades. The orphans who survived, along with a handful of townsfolk who claimed to have seen the smoke with their own eyes, became living testaments to a tragedy that refused to die. Their memories are fractured, sometimes contradictory, yet they form a haunting tapestry of what might have happened within the walls of Ash Hollow Orphanage. Whether they recall fact, imagination, or the residue of trauma is impossible to untangle. But each account bears the same shadow, a sense of being watched, hunted, and consumed by something greater than fire. One of the earliest testimonies came from a boy named Samuel Harker, who was 12 when the first blaze broke out. In his later years, he described waking to the smell of smoke, then seeing shapes moving through the nursery, shapes darker than the surrounding night. They weren't flames, he insisted, decades later in a trembling voice recorded by a local historian. They were shadows with eyes. The fire came after. He claimed that as the heat spread, he heard whispers not in English, but in a tongue he could never identify, words that felt more like commands than speech. To this day, skeptics argue that Samuel's recollections are nothing more than the distortions of a terrified child, but others insist his memory holds a key to something unnatural. Another survivor, a girl named Mary Whitlock, remembered Reverend Thornton's presence differently. She had not described shadows or demons, but rather the man himself standing calmly in the hallway as smoke thickened around him. According to her testimony, recorded in a fragile, almost apologetic tone, Thornton was not panicked like if children were. Instead, he whispered prayers under his breath, staring directly into the flames as if they were in him. He didn't run, she said. He didn't even try to save us, he just watched. Her account cast Thornton not as a protector, but as a figure complicit or at least disturbingly resigned to the disaster. Such memorias clash violently, forcing us to consider how trauma reshapes perception. Psychology tells us that under extreme stress, memory fractures. Some survivors may have transposed their terror into hallucinations, while others may have turned Amon's stoic expression into a symbol of sinister intent. Yet in these contradictions lies the real horror, the inability to know whether these children witness supernatural forces or simply the human face of neglect and cruelty. Adding to this grim archive is the testimony of Clara Evans, one of the oldest orphans at the time. Clara lived long enough to recount her story in detail to several journalists in the 1940s, when interest in Ash Hollow was reignited. She claimed the fires began not in the kitchens or the oil lamps, but in the very air itself. The walls glowed before they burned, she said, like the heat had been waiting inside them, like it wanted out. Her words read like poetry, yet they raise unsettling possibility. Could faulty construction or chemical seepage have caused spontaneous combustion? Or was this description evidence of a mind desperately seeking metaphor for inexplicable horror? Some folklorists argue Clara's account suggests possession not of individuals, but of the building itself. The testimonies were not limited to children. A former staff member, Margaret Collins, who managed the orphanage's laundry, offered perhaps the most chilling recollection. She remembered walking through the corridors late one evening and seeing Reverend Thornton kneeling in prayer before a row of candles. This was not unusual in itself, but she swore the flames bent toward him, flickering uneasily, as if drawn by his words. Days later, the fire struck. Margaret believed firmly until her death that Thornton was experimenting with forces he did not understand, or worse, forces he understood all too well. Yet even Margaret Ackent cannot be separated from bias. Thornton was a polarizing figure. To some, he was a saintly man offering shelter to abandoned children in a forgotten town. To others, he was an obsessive cleric, too harsh, too severe, and perhaps too fascinated by the cleansing power of flame. Survivors' accounts often reflect not just what was seen, but what was believed about Thornton himself. If one saw him as savior, the fires became accidents of fate. If one saw him as zealot, the fires became deliberate rituals. This ambiguity is where psychology collides with folklore. Memory, as scholar Sarg, is not a fixed recording, it is a living, shifting story that adapts over time. For the orphans, each retelling may have been colored by years of fear, by what they read in newspapers, by the hushed debates of adults around them. Trauma creates not clarity, but confusion. And in that confusion, the seeds of myth flourish. Still, certain details recur too often to dismiss. Survivors spoke of eyes, sometimes glowing in corners, sometimes hovering in smoke. Whether these were tricks of light, symptoms of smoke inhalation, or something beyond explanation, the consistency is chilling. They also spoke of whispers, soft voices reciting words that no one could translate, rising in volume until the flames roared. Fire investigators found no evidence of human speech in their reports, but how could they? Smoke and fear have no paper trail. The townsfolk, too, bore witness. A farmer named Elias Granger, who lived near the orphanage, claimed he saw a light like no other that winter night. It was not the orange crackle of flame, he said, but a white glow that pulsed like a heartbeat against the sky. When he ran toward it, by the time he arrived, the building was already collapsing. His testimony, written in a letter preserved in local archives, feeds the notion that the fire was more than mere combustion. Some survivors insisted that after the fires, the building never cooled. Even as ashes settled, they recalled warmth lingering in the air, a heat that clung to the skin days after the blaze should have died. Such accounts lend themselves to superstition, that the orphanage itself remained cursed, that its walls remembered the fire. Scientists argue this is merely the way trauma impresses itself on the senses, making memory of heat linger long after it has passed. But can memory alone explain how multiple children, interviewed separately, described the same eerie warmth? As time wore on, the survivors grew older, their stories both sharpening and fraying with age. Samuel Harker's shadows became more vivid with each retelling. Mary Whitlock's memory of Thornton grew colder, more condemning. Clara Evans' poetic vision sharpened into certainty. Margaret Collins' conviction in Thornton's rituals calcified until she refused to hear any other explanation. Each carried a fragment of truth, but truth itself seemed to dissolve in their hands. What emerges from these testimonies is not a single story, but a kaleidoscope of horror. Some images are unmistakably human: a man too strict with children, a building too poorly maintained, a fire inspector too careless in ruling out hazards. Others errand mystically otherworldly: whispers in empty corridors, shadows that moved on their own, flames that seemed alive. The collision of these images forces us into the same position as the survivors themselves, uncertain, fearful, and endlessly questioning. Psychologists today often cite Ash Hollow as a case study in collective trauma. When groups endure horror, they say, their memories intertwine, blending fact and imagination until one cannot be pried apart from theater. Yet such explanations offer little comfort. For if the survivors were only imagining shadows, what do we make of the official reports noting odd patterns in the burn marks? If the whispers were hallucinations, how do we account for their consistency across unrelated testimonies? This is where the story reaches its most unsettling point, the realization that human memory may not be the sole unreliable narrator. Perhaps the orphanage itself, through its crumbling wooden smoke-choked halls, imprinted something on those who survived. An atmosphere of dread, a presence that fed up and fare. Survivors' accounts, then, may be less about their minds creating illusions and more about their minds struggling to articulate something that could not be comprehended. Innocence and evil, truth and myth, psychology and the supernatural, all entwine in these recollections. The children of Ash Hollow never fully escaped the orphanage, even when they lived to old age. Their testimonies were chains, binding them back to a night that never ended. And as well listen to their words today, we too become bound, caught between belief and disbelief, unable to step outside the fire's lingering glow. The stories of the survivors leave us no closer to certainty. Was Thornton a zealot or a guardian? Were theft flames acts of negligence, ritual, or something unearthly? Did the orphans witness shadows or invent them? The answers dissolve like smoke in the air. What remains is the weight of their voices, fragile, trembling, and insistent. That something terrible happened in Ash Hollow, something that refuses to be explained. And with those voices, we turn outward to the town, to the world beyond Ash Hollow, where theories multiplied, debates raged, and the mystery of orphan flames grew far larger than the ruined building that once held them. The fires of Ash Hollow Orphanage did not end with smoldering ruins and charred timbers. They ignited something far less tangible, yet infinitely more enduring. In the absence of certainty, theories began to bloom like weeds in neglected soil. Over decades, these theories multiplied, twisted, and adapted, finding new shapes in the mouths of storytellers, in notebooks of historians, and in the sleepless imaginations of those who dared to revisit the tragedy. To speak of Ash Hollow today is not to reference a single event, but to wade into a shifting morass of speculation, rumor, and myth, each strand offering a different key to the same locked door. Some insist the key was carved from negligence and human cruelty, while others are convinced it was forged in fire, blood, and something unholy. And through it all, the central question remains unanswered. What, or who, truly burned Ash Hollow from the inside out? The most grounded theories begin with the simplest explanation: accident. Records from the late 19th century reveal that orphanages like Ash Hollow were chronically underfunded, often relying on cheap lantern oil, wooden cots, and threadbare fabrics, all tinder waiting for a spark. A single overturned lamp or a child's careless hand brushing too close to a candle could have a triggered catastrophe. In this view, the fires were tragic, but not mysterious, merely the inevitable outcome of neglect. Survivors recalling the choking, smoke, and collapsing beams are, to some historians, describing nothing more than the predictable consequences of a poorly maintained building in an era when safety standards were little more than wishful thinking. Yet the neatness of this theory falters against the testimony of those who claimed the flames moved with intention, curling and recoiling like a predator testing its prey. Accident, the skeptics argue, does not stare back at you from the darkness with glowing eyes. Another theory walks the line between accident and intent, suggesting deliberate arson. In the climate of suspicion surrounding Reverend Elijah Thornton, it is not inconceivable that townsfolk or even rival religious figures might have seen the orphanage as a target. Fires, after all, erase evidence. If Thornton was engaged in abuses or illegal dealings, flames could silence the most vulnerable witnesses. Conversely, if his presence threatened others in town, destroying his sanctuary would cripple his influence. Some survivors swore they saw shadowed figures fleeing into the night as the building collapsed. Were these imagined shapes conjured by smoke and fire, or the silhouettes of real saboteurs disappearing into the forest? Without names or confessions, the idea lingers as possibility rather than proof. More chilling still are the theories that place Reverend Thornton himself at the heart of the flames. To his followers, Thornton was a stern yet devoted man, willing to discipline harshly, but always for what he proclaimed was divine order. To his detractors, however, he was a zealot teetering on the edge of madness, a man so convinced of his own righteousness that he might have set fire to the orphanage as an act of purgation. The children, in this version, were sacrificed as innocent souls released from worldly suffering to secure some greater spiritual cleansing. Letters attributed to Thornton, though authenticity remains debated, contain phrases about smoke as the Lord's veil and fire as the purifier of corruption. If genuine, they cast his intentions in an even darker light, suggesting the fires were no accident, but a ritual, one he believed sanctified by faith. Yet human malice, even in its most grotesque form, does not fully satisfy those who felt the orphanage bore a curse older than Thornton. Local folklore predating Thebelding itself whispers of the land's history. Long before the orphanage rose, the ground was said to have been the city of a settler massacre, its soil steeped in blood. Other tales reach further back, to the displacement of indigenous tribes, who allegedly warned that the valley carried spirits best left undisturbed. These stories, retold in hushed tones by generations of townsfolk, suggest that Ash Hollow was never a place of sanctuary, but a resting place for anger, sorrow, and unrest. If true, then Thornton did not invite evil in, it was already there, waiting, and he merely built walls around it. Psychologists who later examined survivor testimonies point to another possibility. The fires themselves were real, but his supernatural elements surrounding them were products of trauma. When a child sees walls collapsing, when smoke suffocates lungs, when screams echo in the dark, the mind seeks patterns. Shadows look like watchers. Crackling beams sound like whispers. Heat in the air feels like the breath of something unseen. Memories distorted by terror can harden into legends. For these experts, the glowing eyes and phantom voices were not evidence of demons, but of the fragile ways the brain protects itself from incomprehensible horror. And yet, even this measured explanation falters when weighed against the eerie consistency of testimonies, given decades apart by people who never spoke to each other. How do multiple minds, separated by time and distance, invent the same spectral details? Then there are the theories that move far beyond psychology or history into the territory of the occult. Some claim that Thornton was not merely a misguided precker, but an active participant in rituals cloaked as sermons. The orphanage, with its rows of cots and barred windows, may have doubled as a stage for ceremonies designed to summon or appease entities far older than Christianity itself. Evidence for this rests largely on fragments, symbols carved into beams, cryptic entries in discarded journals, and the persistent rumors of chanting heard on nights when no official service was held. If these accounts are to be believed, the fires were not accidents but offerings, their heat feeding something unseen. Critics dismiss such theories as folklore's natural inflation, but the possibility continues to captivate those who prefer the terrifying elegance of a curse over subtle cruelty of negligence. Equally compelling is the theory of inherited evil, the notion that violence breeds violence, passed down not through blood, but through place. Orphanages often became repositories for society's most forgotten children, abandoned, abused, or already scarred. Within such walls, despair was a constant companion, and cruelty could fester unnoticed. Thornton, whether villain or victim of his own beliefs, may have simply been the final expression of wrath that had been building long before him. Fires, in this view, were less an act of outside malice or supernatural design than the inevitable release of an environment saturated with sorrow. The mythic overlays demons, curses. Glowing eyes are attempts to make sense of the unbearable truth that children were trapped in a world designed to fail them. But myth-shave power facts rarely match. As decades passed, Ash Hollow became less a tragedy to analyze and more a canvas onto which each generation painted its fears. In the 1920s, as whispers of satanic cults filled tabloids, the orphanage fires were cited as proof of hidden cabals. By the 1970s, amid fascination with psychic phenomena, stories shifted to describe the children with strange powers whose uncontrolled energy may have ignited the flames. More recently, paranormal investigators armed with thermal cameras and EVP recorders have visited the ruins, eager to capture evidence of restless spirits. Each cultural moment reshapes the story, layering new interpretations over old ones, ensuring that Ash Hollow never settles into silence. This blending of fact and myth reveals more about us than it does about the orphanage. Humans crave explanation, especially for horrors that defy reason. Negligence feels too mundane, cruelty too unbearable. To name demons, curses, or psychic forces is to shift blame onto the intangible, to make tragedy part of a larger cosmic battle rather than a reminder of our own failures. And so the myths persist, not because they are provable, but because they are useful. They comfort, terrify, and entertain in equal measure. Still, the myths demand we wrestle with uncomfortable questions. Was Thornton a zealot blinded by faith or a vessel for something darker? Were the fires accidents of a crumbling building, or rituals that consumed more than wood and stone? Did children die victims of neglect, or participants in forces they could never understand? In the silence of the ruins, answers remain elusive. Theories abound, myths thrive, and the truth lies somewhere between the smoke and the shadows. What endures is ambiguity. Walk through Ash Hollow today, and you'll find remnants of stone foundations swallowed by ivy, the faint outline of corridors where children once slept, and an air that feels unnaturally still. Visitors report a sudden warmth in the air despite winter frost, or the sensation of eyes tracking them from the tree line. Are these manifestations of curse, spirit, or simply the weight of collective memory pressing down on fragile nerves? Each explanation is plausible, none are complete. And perhaps that is why Ash Hollow continues to haunt. Not because we know what happened, but because we never will. As the years stretch further from the night of the flames, the orphanage ceases to be a singular event and instead becomes a mirror reflecting humanity's endless struggle with evil. Rational minds insist on accidents and psychology, yet whispers refuse to die. Folklore ensures the story remains alive, bending with each retelling, forever reshaping the tragedy into something both familiar and unknowable. In this way, the myths of Ash Hollow are less about Reverend Thornton or the children who perished than about us, the storytellers who cannot let go, the audience forever hungry for meaning, even when meaning slips like smoke through our fingers. And so the debate continues, unresolved, impossible to settle. Accident, arson, zealotry, curse, each theory is a fragment, each myth a shadow. Together they form a mosaic of dread that no single truth can dispel. Ash Hollow endures not as history alone, but as legend, its fires still smoldering in imagination, its mysteries refusing to be extinguished. Whether evil was inherited, nurtured, or conjured, whether it wore the face of a man or something far less human, the orphanage remains a testament to the terrifying power of the unknown. The story does not end because the ruins remain, and where ruins linger, myths are always ready to rise again. Ash Hollow today is little more than a scar on the land, a hushed clearing where vines crawl across the skeletal remains of stone foundations. Birds avoid its canopy, and even the wind seems reluctant to linger too long. To the casual passerby, it is just another ruin reclaimed by time. But to those who know the stories, who have walked its uneven paths with the weight of memory pressing against their chest, the orphanage is anything but ordinary. Its walls may have fallen, yet the echoes remain screams carried on the air, footsteps where no one walks, and an atmosphere heavy with something unnamed. The fires that consumed Ash Hollow were more than physical destruction. They ignited decades of debate, suspicion, and legend, burning themselves into the psyche of all who dared to remember. Some insist the explanation is simple: a candle tipped, a lantern cracked, a careless moment that blossomed into tragedy. Others argue that such rationality is too thin a veil to cover the darkness described by survivors, the glowing eyes, the whispered voices, the sensation of being hunted. Were these hallucinations born of fear or glimpses of forces we refuse to acknowledge? The figure of Reverend Thornton looms like a shadow cast across generations. To some, he was merely a strict man broken by the burdens of responsibility, a human face of flawed authority. To others, he was a fanatic, a zealot who allowed cruelty to masquerade as devotion, perhaps even a willing hand of something more sinister. Did the evil end with him, buried in ash and silence? Or was he only a vessel, one more in a line of vessels through which the inexplicable bleeds into our world? What unsettles most is not what we know, but what we cannot. The children hope perished in Ash Hollow's flames were caught between innocence and terror, their lives extinguished in a moment where explanations blur. Were they victims of human cruelty, of reckless neglect, of cosmic injustice? Or did their own suffering carve open a space for the supernatural, their cries feeding into legends that now shape the way we remember? In this ambiguity lies the orphanage's enduring power, not a story with answers, but a riddle without end. Standing at the edge of the ruins, one cannot help but wonder if truth itself died in the fire. Did it crumble with the beams, collapse with the ceilings, vanish with the final screen that night? Or does it still smolder in the ashes, waiting for someone brave enough or foolish enough to uncover it? That uncertainty is what lingers long after the tale is told. Ash Hollow resists closure. It resists certainty. It demands speculation, feeds on fear, and thrives in myth. And as long as its ruins remain, as long as whispers travel, its story will not fade. It will follow you home, nestle in the back of your mind, and ask you the question no one has ever answered. Was Ash Hollow consumed by accident, by evil, or by something far worse?